All right, y'all. Today's lesson is going to be pretty quick because this is talking about this is called the von Thunen model. That's how you pronounce that guy's name. And this is a model that is a little bit dated. All right, so let's just go ahead and get into it real quick. So, von Thunen model helps explain rural land use. All right, so this is again from the AP uh, the course description. So, explains rural land use by emphasizing the importance of transportation costs associated with distance from the market. But we're going to see why this might be a problem. All right, so this is what von Thunen's model looks like over here, and we'll get into it in just a little bit. And I put this little cat here because take note that this model came out in 1826. And just to give you some perspective, Thomas Jefferson, oops, he died in the year 1826. And so we're talking about a model that is almost 200 years old. And from my own perspective, I don't see the applicability to today's economy. It worked great, and this was very good observation on his part back then, because it did explain how areas were set up. But today's market is very different. But uh, this is part of your curriculum, so we're going to learn it. And so let's look at what this is. So this is his model here, and let's start off actually looking at these assumptions. And here's why this model is not terribly applicable today, and some of the flaws with it. But again, remember it is a model, and models aren't going to be perfect. They just it's a structure, and you can kind of fit it to different areas and see what works. But anyway, so the first assumption is that all land is equal. Eh, land is flat. That there's a single market, and so this is one that is definitely was definitely true back then, because if you were, if this is where you live, there was one market. We didn't have these huge transportation networks, and so that's the key to this. So we have this market here, and then he looked at cities that had developed and how the concentric rings around that city developed in different parts of agriculture. All right. And he also believed that transportation costs were based on distance. And so the further you got away, the higher the transportation cost. And so this should also bring into your thought process the idea of the bid rent theory, meaning that the closer you are to the center of the city, the urban area, the more expensive land is. And so remember, the more expensive land is, that's going to have an impact on whether it's going to be intensive farming or extensive farming. And so, while I personally think that this model is quite outdated for today's world and today's discussion, uh, there is some of this that you can look at and say, okay, and the bid rent theory is one of those, but that's its own theory anyway. This model assumes a self-sustaining, isolated place, and so uh, this was before the trade networks that we see today, before the supply chains that we see today. It assumes that the market is the urban center. Bid rent theory, we talked about that. Transportation costs are key to understanding the model. All right. And spoilage is also another key to understanding the model. And so that's kind of where we're going here. So let's take a look. And so here's the idea. So we'd have the center of the city here. All right. And this is where the market is. This is where you buy stuff. And directly next to that, we would see dairy farming. And dairy farming would be very close to that because of the spoilage problem and the speed that you would want to transfer that to a market. And so remember, 1826, no refrigeration here. So when dairy farmers would produce their product, they needed to be close to the center. And again, this is not relevant today because progress. And so after that, we had the forest area. All right. And so again, if we have a city center here, right around it, you'll have dairy. This is back in 1826. And then we'll have the forest area. And the reason that it's relatively close to the market, to the urban area, is that it is extremely hard back then in 1826 to carry this wood, carry the lumber to the market. Very high transportation costs because it's obviously extremely heavy, and this is before cars because this is 1826. All right, I'll stop. And so next we have, so that would be the next level. And again, if you were to go back in time to a city, this makes a lot of sense before all of the modern technology. And so after that, we'd have grain and field crops. All right. Uh, and hang on just a second, let me check something. And so grain and fuel crops, they don't spoil as much. You need more land for them. And so the transportation costs, it's not as hard to transport grain and field crops as it is compared to forest. And then ranching and livestock, you need lots of land. And so remember, if we are, so using this idea of bid rent theory, actually, let me just go to this other one. So these are the different zones, all right? And notice that this goes from most intensive type of agriculture to the most extensive type of agriculture. And this is land costs. This is the bid rent theory stuff. And so zone one is going to have very high land costs. And so it's going to be more intensive agriculture. Zone four, way out here, is ranching. And so very low land costs, but more expensive. Now, the other funny thing, and this was another video I watched, but you might say, hey, here's these cows or these whatever. Doesn't it take a lot to deliver them in here? And, if you don't kill them out here, but you kill them in here, it's a lot cheaper because they can walk. All right. So anyway, so that helps explain that. Now, Von Thunen today, this is, here's the problem. When Von Thunen came up with this, again, not trying to be very funny, maybe a little bit funny, but again, this is 1826. This did not exist. All right. And so this is the kind of thing that makes this relatively obsolete in today's world. Technology has changed the face of it. So let's just take a look real quick at some of these. Obviously, the assumption that all landscapes are the same is that doesn't hold. Climate does vary in different parts of the world. Multiple markets exist, and so if you're a farmer today, and remember the supply chain, if you're a corn farmer today, your product may go anywhere. It could go into a cow's belly. It could go into your car. It could go over to China. It could go to Brazil. It can go to a lot of different places. There's a ton of different markets for the agricultural products today. And again, we're talking about commercial agriculture, right? And so this is, that assumption that he had that there was a single market. That's not true anymore. Changes in transportation. I had a friend when I lived in South Carolina who owned a pecan plantation or pecan or pecan, however you like. But they would ship their pecans. They would put them on a big one of these container ships that was going back to China, and it was dirt cheap. Remember the cost to get a shirt from Bangladesh to here is 10 cents. And so changes in transportation cost is not the big issue. The same issue that it was. It's still something to consider, but it costs more to get that shirt from Bangladesh to the U.S. than it does to get that shirt from the post office to me. All right, in Tucson. So anyway, the role of force has definitely changed. Different materials, things like that, and then the purpose of agricultural products has expanded. So remember, like I was talking about with corn, I think, what was it, 20% is for human consumption, 40% is for animal consumption, and that we didn't used to do that. And then the other 40% is for biofuels. And so, the markets, the uses of those products has changed a lot. So again, this model, it helped explain things back then, and it could be applicable to some less developed countries today, but still not very well. But AP wants you to know this, and at some point, well, I don't know. AP wants you to know this, and so that's what the von Thunen model is, and it does help explain back then the different types of land use, and that's important. Okay, today is a very different economy, very different world, and a lot of those things, those characteristics back in 1826 are no longer relevant today. All right, so I think that's all I got. That's all. Quick one.